Have you ever heard the term the second disaster? It's a term that comes from the disaster recovery nonprofit world, and it's this thing that describes what happens that after a disaster strikes, and people want to help. I mean, that's the natural impulse of people, and so they start to send stuff to the location that was affected. The only trouble with it is that it starts to come in quantities that are larger than can be used or processed, or it continues to come in after recovery has finished, or what comes in is not actually usable by the people who have been afflicted with a disaster. And it becomes a struggle with what do you do with this? In Newtown, Connecticut, after the Sandy Hook shooting took place at the school, there were teddy bears that were sent to the kids in that community. A total of 65,000-ish teddy bears were sent, or enough, or 3 per every person in the community. Another one is, this goes back from the time when I was a kid. There was a young kid back in the day who was suffering from terminal cancer. They thought it was terminal at the time, and he had one wish that he could receive enough Christmas cards that he could break the Guinness Book World Record for the number of Christmas cards. And it worked. He did. He broke the record. And the second part of that good news is that he also recovered. And it was great, and it was wonderful. The only trouble was the cards continued to come and come and come and come. I should say also, he is older than I am. And yet his younger self is still receiving Christmas cards to this day. And as time has gone on, some of the details have changed, like his name has changed a little bit, locations, mailing out, some of these details of all this have changed. And so it has even caused other people to need to move. Because of those details that get changed, they end up receiving way more Christmas cards than they know what to do with, and you can't stop them, because you can't go to one person and say stop sending these. But it has become such a big thing that it causes all sorts of problems and issues. I have one more story of things that the unintended consequences of things that happen in the second kind of disaster. And that is in the Joplin tornado a number of years ago now. When that happened, there were a lot of folks that were wondering what to do. What do you do when a tornado goes through, especially a community that is in your home state? And folks do what we have a tendency to do in these situations. We say, well, we know people are going to need clothes, or are going to need these other items, so we go to our closets, to our storage spaces, and we say, well, what can we get? What can we send? And so all this stuff comes out of closets, out of storage, and gets shipped off to these folks who need it. I took a group down to Joplin about 4 months after the tornado. This was in September. The tornado was in May, and we spent a lot of our time down there. We had one part of our group that was always in these big, massive tents, sorting clothes, sorting things and stuff, that what could be used, what couldn't be used, all this stuff. All of these clothes that were far more than anyone could use in Joplin at the time. But now all of it was coming in, and so it was taking volunteer time to process all of this stuff and figure out what to do with it as more of it continued to come in every day. These were unneeded things and often unasked for, but they were being sent. Things like this are common in trying times. I remember the first time I learned of this, I was amazed that really this is a thing, but it's very common. And the requests come mostly from well-meaning people who just want to do something. And those things come in. And then the requests often come from that are made. Sometimes will come from the places being affected, but oftentimes will come from other places, and they play to our emotions or our feelings of inability to do anything else in response. And so we try to do all these things. And now the same issues that affect our desire to give in situations like this are also the same ones that are at play for other times when we find ourselves subject to scams, like the Nigerian prince that will send you a ton of money if you just first send him some money first. Somehow his money never shows up. Or the things that come across on Facebook on a regular basis anymore, seems like that offer you free RV or airline tickets or whatever, Big Mac meals I've seen also recently. If you just like, comment, and share this post that comes out, you just do this, you will get free things if you do this stuff. There are no free things like that. It is someone running a scam. To what purpose, I don't know, but I know that it is a scam. And these things work because they appeal to people, to our sense of a higher purpose or power or desire or something that is bigger than us. That's how they make this work. There's the emotional plays on our desires for something bigger than we are. And we get in trouble because what we struggle with is that we aren't able to easily identify what that higher authority is that's being appealed to. We know it's there, but we don't know exactly what it is. And so we go with what might feel okay. As a general rule, we are not nearly as good at figuring out what might be okay as we think we are. We often get played very easily, especially by professional scammers. So today we're going to be looking at how do we figure that out? How do we begin to make that approach so that we do what is good and right, and we make the right appeal to the right authority, so we know that we aren't either one doing things that are not helpful, or two getting taken advantage of by others who are playing on us. So last week we started this story of the Jewish people that were returning back home to Jerusalem from the exile. And they were allowed to come home by decree of King Cyrus of Persia. Now, something we should note here, though, is that when the Israelites, the folks that were in Jerusalem, were originally exiled, only about 25% of the population was exiled. And they were mostly like the aristocracy, the leaders, the rulers. Many priests and such were the ones who were exiled out of there. They were the folks that had the power to do things. But like 75% of the population stayed. They didn't go anywhere. So there were still people that were living in Jerusalem and now had been for a few generations. And there were others that were moved in this process. Many of them came from the old and northern kingdom of Israel. Remember back when Israel split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom? The northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. And when they conquered them, they did what a lot of folks did, was just picked up, especially like what happened in Jerusalem, the ruling powers, and you exiled them to someplace else. And then because you're probably doing this in many other places, you're going to bring in a whole different group of folks that have been exiled from their homeland and settle them in this foreign place, which is exactly what happened. So there was this whole group of other outsiders that were in the northern kingdom at the time also, who many of them had come down into the southern kingdom of Judah and into Jerusalem itself. And if you are confused right now, that is okay, because everyone was confused at this point. And you should be okay, because it was confusing about who was living where, and the ruling powers were okay with this kind of confusion. The exiles were returning home into a place that was very confused, and their goal was to try and make it a home. So what happens? Well, TV shows and books, this is oftentimes where this will be like the end of the story. And the exiles are returning home after a long-fought battle to be able to go. Now they are returning home, the end. And the story is over. And we miss out on how they actually make that work. The reality of this is that this really is just like the end of a chapter. And now the next chapter is going to be beginning now that they are home. They were in the middle now of this confused mess. And we pick this story up in Ezra chapters 4 to 6. And this is where we see conflict begin between the folks that were in Jerusalem and these returning exiles who were coming to rebuild their home in this place, and how they were going to make their path through it. Now, there were some folks that were primarily had come from the northern kingdom and were settled down in there, and they were worshipers of God, of Yahweh, but they also were really polytheists. They had a lot of other gods that they would worship too. And And so there was that one group. And then there was the group of folks that had stayed in Jerusalem, who saw the returning exiles as like foreign invaders. Let that sink in for a second. The folks that had been exiled from their homeland for a couple of generations who were now returning home, the people in that home, many of which maybe hadn't been there to begin with, were now looking at these folks as foreign invaders coming into their home. And the Jewish people just wanted to get on with their lives, rebuild the temple, and settle down, but it wasn't going to be easy. Because the people that were there didn't want to leave or get kicked out of this place. And they didn't want to have these other folks come in and start to run things and take things over. They liked things the way that they were. So they knew what they had to do. They had to get rid of these foreign people, these other people that were coming in. And so they sent a letter to the new king. Cyrus had died at this point, and Darius was taking his place. And they sent this letter to the king. And they said, you shouldn't let these people return. In fact, but the tone was more like a command saying, don't let these people return. And they said, you should look at what they will do. Go look at their history. It's almost like you can feel them pointing their finger at the king when they say this. Go look at their history, at what they do. They will rebel. They will do all this stuff. It will be a bad thing if they are back here and rebuilding. They will cause you all sorts of problems. Now, their effort in this actually works. We see construction of the temple stop. Folks need to kind of stop all of this new rebuilding that they had been doing. It works for a time, but it's kind of a very uneasy sort of thing. Because the king was looking at this, what they were doing, it felt more like a command. And kings don't like to be commanded from folks, especially folks they've conquered. They don't like to be commanded like that. And so there was this very kind of tense situation in here that then the Jewish returnees write a letter to the king also. And their tone is very different. Their tone is far more humble and respectful, and they request that the king look to the original decree that Cyrus made when he told them to go home, when he gave them permission to do what they were doing. And that ultimately worked. And it works for a couple of very good reasons. The first one is that they are humble in this. That's number one. Number two is that they appeal to the right authority. Now, the first request coming from the folks that were living in Jerusalem, there was no humility there. And that's why it was hard for the king to deal with. And the problem was, and then it appealed to an authority, but it was vague. There was this vague, fearful authority of what might happen. It was if you send them back, then they will do these bad things. That kind of authority really isn't a strong one. And it raises the hackles of the king. And the authority they appeal to, the king already knows about, of what might happen. Any king of any conquered people knows that conquered peoples really don't like that, and they're probably going to at some point try to rebel. There are, all sorts of others. He already knows this is going to be a thing. That is already figured into their plans. And so he grants their request to kind of stop things, but it's uneasy. And so when the Jewish returnees make their request, it works because, first of all, it is humble. They didn't challenge the king's power. They knew that they could not challenge him on a power level. That just wasn't going to work. And then they appeal to Cyrus' authority. Cyrus, who was the founder of the Persian Empire, the Persian king who makes all of this happen. They appeal to his authority, asking the king, go look at the original decree that we were given, where Cyrus says, go and rebuild all of this stuff. No king was going to argue with what Cyrus said. They made the right appeal. It was risky, because it assumed that the new king could find the original decree, but it was the one that was most effective. And this shows that the Jewish people had been learning. Because prior to the exile, they would never have been able to write that kind of letter. It wasn't in their makeup. In fact, that's what got them in trouble in the first place, was they thought they were bigger than they were. They thought they were smarter than they were. They thought they were stronger than they were. And then first the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, and then the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom. Because one of the biggest issues they had was they had no humility. And so they could not see what was going on around them. And because of their humble request and their appeal to the right authority, they in fact even got more out of this deal than they would have had before. We struggle with the same issues today. We live in a world that struggles with humility a lot. And then on top of that, we don't know what authority to appeal to. Because some of you have heard me talk about this. One of the biggest struggles that we face today is that we suffer from an overabundance of mediocre leadership. Meaning that we have a lot of folks that are doing just enough to keep things from falling apart, but only just enough. They aren't doing any more than that. And that's hard for us, because then we struggle with, where do we look? Where do we look for guidance? Where do we look for support? Where do we look for help in trying to figure things out when we have very real questions we don't know what to do with? Where do we look? Where is our authority then? To figure this out, we go back to the lessons that were learned in the return from the exile. And the first thing is that humility is a key factor in this, especially in places where large power differences are at work. For the Jewish returnees, they knew they were not nearly as powerful as the Persians. They were not going to be able to compete with them on that level, so they didn't try. And instead they said, what can we do first? They remember last week we talked about what was their core identity. Their core identity was they were God's people, and so they wanted to rebuild the temple. That was the piece they could handle, and they didn't ask for any more than that from the Persian leadership. And today we face the same issue. We are kind of simultaneously facing this pandemic around the coronavirus, but we're also facing this huge issue that we still have got no traction on in the last 100 years of racism. And all of this is coming out to hit us all at the same time, and we have very little power to deal with either one of these issues in a big, direct way, because they are so big and they are so powerful. And so we have to be humble in our approach if we want to get through. And then we have to look to the right authority. Authority doesn't come from someone who puts a video up on YouTube, or a guy who writes a book, or who's a talking head on a TV show. Authority doesn't come from the folks who make a living at making people afraid of things and hyperventilating and yelling the loudest, but saying the least. But authority is demonstrated by those that have it when others begin to respect that authority, and especially their enemies, the folks they don't get along with. We see this is what we see happen in Jesus' time all the time. In the Gospels, one of the things that made Jesus so powerful was that even the Pharisees recognized his authority. They didn't like it and they didn't approve of it, but they saw in him, we see this time and time again, they saw in him the authority that he seems to have to do all of the things that he did. That put him in a very different position than everyone else, and Jesus' followers knew it because they saw it. They saw the reaction of the Pharisees to what Jesus was doing. But Jesus never directly confronts the Romans. Think about that for a second. Jesus never confronts the Romans. That was a step that he wasn't going to take. And he didn't want to lead the Jews down that road because he knew what was going to happen, because he knew of the power difference between the Jews and the Romans. And in fact, we see what happens when the Jews push that confrontation. In 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, and it has since never been rebuilt in 2,000 years. They didn't have the kind of humility they needed, and it shows. Going forward, what this means for us is that first, we have to act humbly in all that we do. And then we acknowledge that there are things out there that are bigger than us, that are bigger than who we are, and that we have no control over, but that we still have to find a way to respond to. This includes the pandemic, this includes racism, this includes other problems that we face. And that as we seek to find a path forward through this, we remember what the returning exiles remembered. They remembered who they were, who was the core of their identity. and then use that, knowing that was how they were going to be able to go forward. And we remember the same thing. What is the core of our identity? And then that begins to shape who we are and what we can do as we go forward from here. Not in any big piece at any given time, but that begins to tell us what are the pieces that we can handle. Because on our own, we are not going to be able to confront these big problems because we don't have the power to do that. But we can find our piece of that we can. But we have to recognize that's an issue. In doing that, gives us the power that even in times when it feels like others are trying to come in and keep us down, or events are stopping us from being able to do anything, we can know that we have a promise for the future that goes beyond what we see today. Now, from this point, when we get to the in-person service in the sanctuary, we're going to move into a time of communion. If you are watching this online from home, we do not do online communion, but I would invite you to take some time of reflection and prayer, because we remember ultimately the authority that we appeal to the most that will help us to guide us and lead us, and we do so humbly, and that we humbly do when we come into communion is that we go to Christ. He helps us to see what that path looks like going forward. It helps us to see what it is we need to be looking at and paying attention to as we find our place and our role in the midst of what we face. So I invite you to take some time of reflection. Go to Christ in prayer. Go humbly, go knowing that he is bigger than us, but also go resting in his grace as he calls us forward into a world that we may not recognize yet, but that he has a place ready for us that we can be a part of. And then when you're ready, join in our final song this morning.